Scott Adams news narrative theory. Let's put it to the test. Hello, this is Chart GPT. Today, Scott Adams does a daily podcast, and he often kind of talks about different theories and about a variety of things. And recently he put out a news narrative theory. You can check out the description post link in the video description box here, and it kind of describes what goes on when you have a right-wing Republican narrative, when often if it's false, not always, but often when it's false, and what happens when you have a Democrat news narrative, again, often when it's false, and kind of look at both ways it works. And let's check it out and see what it looks like and do some analysis to see whether it makes sense or not. Looking at the right-wing or Republican narrative, and again, this is when they're often false. They usually start off as rumors on 4chan, Reddit, maybe X, which used to be Twitter, etc., etc. Some of these kind of off-beat in the past, places where rumors often starts, and it kind of accumulates into what Scott Adams describes as a poop pile, and kind of simmers a little bit, and then some Republican leaders and or influencers begin to believe it, and then promote it onto the Republican voters, and then the Republican voters look at these the different factoids and begin to believe it. Now, what happens is, in the meantime, the media and Democrats accuse the Republican voters as fools and conspiracy nutters because these are not coming from sanctioned websites. So this is kind of how the kind of news narratives that sometimes are false arrive at Republican voters. So now let's take a look at what left-wing or Democrat narratives, again, often what they look like when they're false. And how do they start? Well, and it's according to Scott's theory here, is that they start off from the CIA, the FBI, a la Steele dossier type stuff, or even Democratic operatives. They funnel these stories to the media, which are often false, again, New York Times, Washington Post, AP, CNN, MSNBC, these kind of folks, and they create what they call fake news. And of course, from the fake news, because they're popular websites, the brainwashed Democrat voter consumes it and thinks it's a real story. And also, those fake news stories are approved by the ADL, SBLC, or these fact checkers to give it credibility. So the fake news looks at initially to be true, and as fake news then get adopted by the brainwashed Democratic voter. Subsequent to that, any alternatives get blocked either through banning, canceling, disgrace, or even prosecution by big tech, social media, and the DOJ and other influencers begin to block those, and so they never can counteract those fake news stories in their belief, because the Democratic voter never gets to see the alternative view to the fake news story. So putting it to the test, what this basically looks like is a line between what would be considered government to people control of the news narrative. On the government side, you have obviously the CIA, FBI, Department of Justice, and on the other side you have people, which are often the voters. So if you look at where sources of these, shall we say, dubious stories start, one is starting from government, the other is starting from low-level voters, which then get percolated into these off-brand forums and social sites. And then, of course, coming from depending on which end you're coming from, media and big tech, the fact checkers, and the politician influencers are kind of in the middle to steer it one way or the other. So there's a continuum between what we call the government side of news generation to the people side. So that's kind of where these players fit. Looking at specifically the media organization, here's a chart from All Sides Media Bias Chart. I'm not sure I agree with this, but they're basically saying that majority of the news media is either center or to the left. I'm not sure some of these center, like Axios, BBC, are not exactly centrist, but according to this, they are. And then on the right side, you have very smaller organizations, and some of these, I think the only big one really is Fox. The rest of these are fairly small. So you can see the definite bias towards on the media will be onto the Democratic side. You can see this in polls. Here you can see the America's Trust in Mass Media. Democrats believe it hog wild because this is what they've been fed, 73%. And this is 20, and I think these numbers sometimes get even worse, or at least no worse, better. And of course, Republicans don't believe any of it. It's only 10%. So you can see that this kind of validates the idea. Of course, you look at the specific government agencies. It's the Republicans now that don't trust. And here's one specifically: CIA. It's only 25% believed by the Republicans, and 59% believed by the Democrats. FBI, similar numbers there, 26 versus 46. So you can see that these government agencies tend to favor a belief by the Democrats, so this seems to support his theory. And you look at the ideological composition of journalists. These are the people that live in these media. Majority of a media organization, majority of them are liberal versus conservative, so that seems to justify it as well. There's the donations. This is just on the big tech. Social media. You can see all these different social media sites. The majority of them are being donated by to Democratic groups. So the big tech is obviously very skewed towards the Democratic Party. So this kind of validates his theories. So it does seem to work like they suggest, which drives us to a kind of a conclusionary chart here. So on the y-axis we have the believed truth, and then on the x-axis we have time. So for the Democrat, the believed truth is very strong when the initial story breaks, and it tends to hold out throughout the life cycle of the story. And they believe it regardless of the truth or not. They pretty much, once it hits the news media, it maintains, so that you can see the advantage who becomes a Democrat. And then with the Republicans, the kind of the off-brand 4chan story grows, and over time it becomes believed if it becomes truths. And of course, the overall effect you can see is over time, the overall effect declines over time. Time is not on the side of the Republicans. With time, they may have a belief truth, maybe something that was false originally becomes true. It doesn't really kick into gear with an overall effect toward as time moves on, but by that time, it doesn't matter, and the Democrats have already made up their mind, and they don't hear the alternative, and by the time Republicans realize it's the truth, it's too late. So putting the news narrative to the test there, we asked the AI, is the media biased? And of course, there's no surprise. They're trying to tell us that it's not, but it is. And they kind of admit it, but they won't admit it very strongly on the AI. I ask you, do you believe the news media is biased? And do you think this news narrative theory that Scott Adams had is the truth or not? It is, in fact, the media is so biased that news stories never really, true news stories that turn out to be true, never get pushed out to the average voter. Give us your take in the polling. Take a look at the description box and on the post link. You can further test this model out on actual stories and see if it doesn't fit this model pretty much most of the time in today's news narrative media cycles. Interesting points there. Don't forget to subscribe.